The HOA president's face drained of color as the power went out across the entire neighborhood. Her arrogant demands to take down the Martins' solar panels had backfired spectacularly. Now, with no electricity and a mountain of angry residents at her doorstep, she knew her reign of petty tyranny was over. Sarah Martin stared defiantly at the HOA president, Marie Granger, as she delivered the ultimatum. You have 30 days to remove those unsightly solar panels from your roof, or we'll take legal action. You can't be serious, Sarah scoffed. These panels save us hundreds on our electricity bills, and they're better for the environment. We have strict guidelines about approved home exterior modifications, Marie said, her lips pressed into a thin line. Solar panels simply don't fit the aesthetic of our neighborhood. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. This is discrimination, plain and simple. My family has the right to make eco-friendly choices for our home. The rules apply to everyone equally, Marie retorted. You'll remove those panels, or we'll have them taken down at your expense. Furious, Sarah stormed inside to tell her husband, Matt. Can you believe the nerve of that woman? Just because our panels don't match their perfect little suburban vision. Matt ran a hand through his hair, brow furrowed. I was afraid this might happen. The HOA has always been control freaks. But we have to stand our ground on this one. Damn right we do, Sarah said, eyes glinting with determination. We're not backing down without a fight. Over the next few weeks, the Martins mounted a campaign to rally their neighbors against the HOA's solar panel ban. They circulated petitions, organized town hall meetings, and plastered the community with flyers highlighting the environmental and financial benefits of solar power. At the next HOA meeting, the room was packed with angry residents, many of whom had also installed solar panels on their homes. One by one, they stood up to voice their opposition to the restrictive policy. Marie tried to maintain order, but the crowd's jeers and shouts drowned out her attempts. This is undemocratic, a man in the back yelled. We won't be bullied by your outdated rules. Just as things were reaching a boiling point, the lights suddenly flickered and went dark. The room fell silent, then erupted in a chorus of shocked gasps and frustrated murmurs. Marie's face drained of color as she realized the entire neighborhood had lost power. She frantically tried to reach the utility company, but her calls went unanswered. Outside, the Martins watched with a mixture of vindication and concern as their neighbors poured out of the community center, fumbling in the darkness. Well, Matt said, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Looks like karma just caught up with the HOA. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. I hope this teaches them a lesson, but I feel bad for everyone going through this. We should go see if anyone needs help. As they made their way through the powerless streets, the Martins couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. One thing was certain. The battle over solar panels was far from over. The next morning, the neighborhood was in chaos. Residents trudged through the streets, clutching cell phones and flashlights, trying to figure out what had happened. Sarah and Matt stepped outside to find their neighbors, the Wilsons, standing on their driveway. Can you believe this? Mrs. Wilson cried. The whole grid is down. The power company says it could be days before they can restore service. That's crazy, Matt said, shaking his head. Do they know what caused the outage? Mrs. Wilson threw up her hands in frustration. No one seems to have a clue. All I know is my fridge is full of spoiling food, and my kids can't even charge their phones. Sarah placed a comforting hand on the woman's arm. Don't worry, we'll figure this out together. In the meantime, you're welcome to come over and use our generator. That's so kind of you, Mrs. Wilson said, her shoulders visibly relaxing. I might just take you up on that. As the Wilsons headed to the Martins' house, Marie Granger emerged from her front door, phone pressed to her ear. Her usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, and her face was etched with worry. This is unacceptable. She barked into the receiver. My neighborhood can't be without power for days. find the problem, and fix it immediately. Marie caught sight of the Martins and glared at them, her eyes narrowing. Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of satisfaction at the HOA president's obvious distress. "I'm sure the power company is doing everything they can," Sarah called out. "In the meantime, maybe you should focus on helping your neighbors instead of harassing us about solar panels." Marie's lips tightened into a thin line, but she didn't respond, turning on her heel and stalking back inside. As the day wore on, the neighborhood grappled with the blackout's impact. Without electricity, many residents struggled to keep their food from spoiling, charge their devices, or even cook a hot meal. The community center became a makeshift shelter, with people gathered there to stay cool and share resources. Through it all, the Martins opened their home to their neighbors, offering food, power, and a listening ear. Sarah couldn't help but notice the growing resentment towards the HOA leadership, especially Marie. "This whole thing is her fault. You know," one of their neighbors, a retired nurse named Evelyn, confided to Sarah. "If she hadn't been so stubborn about the solar panels, maybe the power grid wouldn't have overloaded." Sarah nodded solemnly. "I'd agree. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning of the HOA's troubles." As night fell and the neighborhood settled into an uneasy darkness, Sarah caught a glimpse of Marie's silhouette in her window, pacing back and forth. The woman looked utterly powerless, both literally and figuratively. "Karma's a bitch, isn't it?" Sarah murmured, a small smile playing on her lips. The next morning, the power outage continued, much to the HOA's frustration. Mary Granger had spent a restless night pacing her darkened living room, trying in vain to reach the utility company. As dawn broke, she stormed out of her house, determined to take matters into her own hands. Marching down the street, she approached a group of neighbors huddled around a portable radio. "Any updates on when the power will be restored?" she demanded, drawing startled looks from the group. "Nothing yet," one of the men replied, eyeing Marie warily. "They're still trying to pinpoint the problem." Marie's jaw tightened. "This is completely unacceptable. My neighborhood can't be without electricity for days on end." "Maybe if you hadn't been so stubborn about the solar panels, this wouldn't have happened," a woman chimed in, her tone laced with accusation. Marie's face flushed with anger. "That has nothing to do with this outage. Our rules are in place to maintain the integrity of our community." "Rules that put your own interests ahead of your neighbors," the woman shot back. "Maybe it's time for a change in leadership around here." The murmurs of agreement from the group only fueled Marie's growing sense of panic. She opened her mouth to retort, but a sudden commotion at the end of the street caught everyone's attention. A pickup truck had pulled up, its bed filled with large, industrial-looking equipment. Two men in uniform hopped out and began unloading the gear, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers. "What's going on?" Marie demanded, striding towards the men. One of the workers, a burly man with a grease-stained cap, turned to address her. "We're here to assess the damage to the power grid and try to get the system back online." Marie's brow furrowed. "Damage? What happened?" "Looks like there was some kind of surge or overload that tripped the main breakers," the worker explained. "We're bringing in portable generators to provide temporary power while we make the necessary repairs." Marie's eyes widened as the implications dawned on her. "You mean, this is because of the solar panels?" The worker shrugged. "Can't say for sure, ma'am. Could be a number of factors. All I know is, we've got our work cut out for us to get the juice flowing again." As the workers began setting up the generators, a hush fell over the gathering crowd. Marie stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing. She had pushed so hard to ban the solar panels, never once considering the possibility that they could be the root cause of the outage. Nearby, Sarah and Matt watched the scene unfold, equal parts vindicated and concerned. They exchanged a meaningful glance, both knowing that this was only the beginning of the HOA's reckoning. As the utility workers scrambled to set up the temporary generators, an uneasy hush fell over the crowd. Mary Granger stood in stunned silence, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just heard. The solar panels, the very thing she had fought so hard to ban from the neighborhood, were now being identified as a potential cause of the widespread power outage. Marie's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment, her carefully curated image of control slipping away. Nearby, Sarah and Matt observed the unfolding scene with a sense of grim satisfaction. They had warned Marie that her campaign against the solar panels was misguided, but their concerns had fallen on deaf ears. Now, the consequences of her actions were on full display for the entire community to see. As the workers continued their work, a small group of neighbors began to gather around Marie, their expressions a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I can't believe this is happening," one woman said, shaking her head. "All because you wanted to keep our neighborhood perfect." Marie opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. For once, the usually eloquent HOA president found herself at a loss for words. Another neighbor, a retired engineer, stepped forward. "You know, I've been saying for years that the HOA's policies are outdated and short-sighted. This outage is just the latest example." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Sarah could see the tension building in Marie's posture. It was clear that the once untouchable HOA president was now facing a growing rebellion from her own constituents. Just then, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Evelyn, the retired nurse who had spoken to Sarah the previous day. She stepped up to Marie, her expression steely. "You know, the solar panels aren't the only thing that's wrong with this neighborhood," Evelyn said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "It's time for some real change around here." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marie's face fell. It was becoming increasingly clear that her reign of control was slipping through her fingers, and the residents were no longer willing to blindly follow her dictates. As the utility workers continued their work, Sarah and Matt exchanged a knowing glance. They had always known that standing up to the HOA's oppressive rules would come with consequences, but they never imagined that the tables would turn so dramatically. "I guess karma really is a bitch," Matt murmured, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Sarah nodded, her own expression a mix of satisfaction and concern. "Let's just hope this teaches the HOA a lesson they won't soon forget." As the temporary generators hummed to life, slowly restoring power to the neighborhood, a palpable sense of unease hung in the air. Marie Granger, the once untouchable HOA president, found herself at the center of a growing storm of scrutiny and resentment. Evelyn, the outspoken retired nurse, continued to rally the crowd, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the gathered neighbors. "This outage is just the latest example of the HOA's misguided priorities," she declared, her gaze fixed on Marie. "They care more about maintaining their own power and control than actually serving the best interests of our community." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marie felt her face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Nearby, Sarah and Matt observed the unfolding scene with a mix of satisfaction and concern. They knew that this moment represented a turning point, not just for the HOA, but for the entire neighborhood. "This is what we've been waiting for," Matt murmured to his wife. "But I can't help but feel a little uneasy about where it's all going to lead." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed. "I know what you mean. This could get ugly real fast if Marie doesn't back down and start listening to the people." As the power began to trickle back into the homes, the residents began to mobilize. Impromptu meetings sprung up in driveways and front yards as neighbors discussed the future of the HOA and its leadership. Marie, sensing the growing tide of opposition, retreated to the safety of her home, her phone glued to her ear as she frantically tried to reach the utility company and secure a more permanent solution to the power outage. But the damage had already been done, and the residents were no longer willing to accept her autocratic rule. "We need to call an emergency HOA meeting," Evelyn announced, her voice carrying over the crowd. It's time to hold Marie and the rest of the board accountable for their actions. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at the community's newfound resilience. They were no longer passive victims, but rather active participants in shaping the future of their neighborhood. As the day wore on, the power continued to be restored, but the tension in the air remained palpable. Marie Granger, once the unquestioned leader of the HOA, now found herself on the precipice of a full-blown rebellion. Sarah and Matt watched from their porch, uncertain of what the future held, but knowing that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. "I guess the HOA's chickens have finally come home to roost," Matt murmured, a wry smile on his face. Sarah squeezed his hand, her own expression a mix of hope and trepidation. "I just hope the neighborhood can come out of this stronger and more united than ever before." As the sun began to set, the power in the neighborhood was fully restored, but the simmering tensions remained. Word had spread quickly about the emergency HOA meeting that Evelyn had called, and the streets were buzzing with activity as residents prepared to confront the embattled leadership. Sarah and Matt watched from their porch as a growing crowd gathered at the community center. They exchanged a worried glance, knowing that this moment could make or break the future of their neighborhood. "Do you think Marie will even show up after how things went down earlier?" Matt asked, his brow furrowed. Sarah sighed heavily. "She has to. This is her last chance to try and regain control. But I have a feeling the residents aren't going to make it easy for her." As the meeting time approached, Marie Granger emerged from her home, her expression tense and her posture rigid. She moved with purpose towards the community center, flanked by a few loyal members of the HOA board. The crowd parted to let her pass, their murmurs and whispers filling the air. Sarah could see the unease in Marie's eyes, the once confident woman now visibly shaken by the growing opposition. Inside the community center, the room was packed to capacity, with residents spilling out into the hallways. Evelyn stood at the front, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "We're here tonight to address the ongoing issues with the HOA and its leadership." A smattering of applause broke out, and Evelyn raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "As you all know, the recent power outage has highlighted the HOA's questionable priorities and decision-making. We've allowed our neighborhood to be ruled by a small group of individuals who have forgotten that their role is to serve the community, not dictate to it." More applause erupted, and Evelyn paused to let the sentiment sink in. "Now it's time for us to take back control. We need new leadership, one that is responsive to the needs and concerns of every resident, not just those who fit a certain aesthetic or agenda." The crowd roared its approval, and Sarah could see the color draining from Marie's face as she realized the tide had turned against her. When Evelyn called for nominations for the new HOA board, dozens of hands shot up, each resident eager to be a part of the change. As the meeting descended into a chaotic but empowering discussion, Sarah turned to Matt, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and hope. "I think this is the beginning of a new era for our neighborhood," she said, a smile spreading across her face. Matt nodded, his own expression mirroring hers. "It's about damn time." The emergency HOA meeting was a whirlwind of activity, with residents passionately voicing their concerns and demands for change. Evelyn, the retired nurse who had emerged as the de facto leader of the rebellion, maintained an unwavering control over the proceedings, ensuring that every voice was heard. Marie Granger, the embattled HOA president, sat in stunned silence as one by one, her loyal supporters on the board were voted out in favor of new, more progressive candidates. The once iron-fisted ruler of the neighborhood found herself rapidly losing her grip on power. As the meeting wore on, the momentum for reform only continued to build. Residents proposed sweeping changes to the HOA's bylaws, including the creation of oversight committees, term limits for board members, and a more transparent decision-making process. Sarah and Matt watched the proceedings with a mix of pride and relief. They had never imagined that their decision to install solar panels would snowball into a full-blown uprising against the HOA's oppressive rule. "Can you believe this is happening?" Matt whispered to his wife, his eyes alight with a sense of vindication. Sarah squeezed his hand, a small smile playing on her lips. "I always knew our neighbors were capable of standing up for themselves." Looks like Marie finally met her match. The climax of the meeting came when Evelyn called for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA leadership. The results were decisive, with an overwhelming majority voting to remove Marie and her remaining board members from office. As the announcement was made, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Marie's face was a mask of fury and disbelief, her carefully constructed facade of control shattered beyond repair. "This isn't over," she cried, her voice shrill and desperate. "You'll all regret this." But her words were drowned out by the thunderous ovation of the residents, who had finally reclaimed their power and their community. In the aftermath of the meeting, a sense of cautious optimism permeated the neighborhood. The newly elected HOA board wasted no time in implementing the proposed reforms, promising greater transparency, responsiveness, and a renewed focus on the needs and concerns of all residents, not just the privileged few. As the Martins returned home, they couldn't help but reflect on the remarkable turn of events. Who would have thought that our little solar panels would trigger such a massive upheaval? Sarah mused, shaking her head in disbelief. Matt wrapped his arm around her shoulders, a triumphant grin on his face. "I guess sometimes the best kind of justice is the kind that's served cold," and with a healthy dose of irony. Together, they watched as their neighbors celebrated their newfound freedom, the future of their community looking brighter than ever before. In the days and weeks that followed the dramatic HOA meeting, the Martins and their neighbors reveled in the newfound sense of community and empowerment. The once stifling neighborhood had been transformed, with residents eager to contribute their ideas and energy to shaping its future. The new HOA board, led by the indomitable Evelyn, wasted no time in implementing the promised reforms. They established open communication channels, soliciting feedback from all residents and actively involving them in the decision-making process. Gone were the days of top-down edicts and heavy-handed enforcement. As for Marie Granger, the former HOA president, she had all but disappeared from the neighborhood, her reputation and influence in tatters. The residents took great satisfaction in witnessing her unceremonious fall from grace, a stark reminder that unchecked power and arrogance ultimately lead to downfall. Sarah and Matt, the catalyst for the entire uprising, found themselves at the center of the community's newfound sense of unity and purpose. Their solar panels, once the source of so much conflict, had become a symbol of the neighborhood's embrace of sustainability and environmental stewardship. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Matt mused one evening as he and Sarah sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Sarah nodded, a content smile playing on her lips. "It's like a weight has been lifted off all of us. We can finally breathe and focus on making this place truly feel like home." They were interrupted by the sound of laughter and chatter drifting from down the street. Curious, they stepped off their porch to investigate and found their neighbors gathered for an impromptu block party, complete with a makeshift stage and a local band performing. "Looks like the fun is over there," Matt said, grinning. Sarah linked her arm through his, and together they made their way towards the festivities. As they approached the crowd, they were greeted with a chorus of cheers and friendly waves. "There they are, the solar panel pioneers," Evelyn exclaimed, beckoning them over. "Come join the celebration." The Martins exchanged a look of pure joy, both knowing that this was just the beginning of a new era for their neighborhood. As they immersed themselves in the lively gathering, surrounded by their empowered and engaged neighbors, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride and gratitude. The HOA's attempt to control and conform had backfired spectacularly, and in its wake, a community had risen, stronger, more resilient, and ready to embrace a future filled with boundless possibilities.